Hello and welcome to Photoshop Basics. So this is going to be a super introductory look at working in Adobe Photoshop. If you are already familiar with Photoshop, this is probably not the video for you. We're going to take a quick walkthrough of setting up a new document and what some of the tools look like. Photoshop's a beefy program, so we're not going to get to every single little tool in Photoshop. I'm going to hit the highlights of most commonly used tools. So when I open up Photoshop, I am going to create a new document. So you can go to File, New. When you open a new document, you get this window. And this window has a lot of cool features to it. It allows you to choose your artboard size. Now that's really important to be aware of when you're working. You want to make sure that your artboard is properly set up in color space as well as DPI. Photoshop is a raster-based program. That means that your resolution is finite. So if you make something and it is low resolution, you cannot add resolution to it. You can take away resolution and make a smaller image. Once it's gone forever. You cannot rewrite that information. So that is important to be aware of when you're creating your new artboard or document size, that you know what your output is. So if this is the first time firing up Photoshop, you might not have all of these things. This is the most recent 20 items that I've created a lot of web graphics. You can save different artboard sizes if you use something a lot. If I click over into the photo tab, it gives me different photo sizes. So this says 7x5 at 300 DPI, understanding that 300 PPI or DPI, which stands for pixels per inch or dots per inch, interchangeable, is a print size. Anytime you print, you must be working in 300 PPI. That is the standard for print medium. So 7x5, 2x3, 6x4, understanding this is American standard as well. So it's set in inches versus centimeters. I can look at my print sizes. Again, you see how these are 300 PPI because it is a print size. If I go to web, notice that changes to 72 DPI and the measurements go to pixels. So they're not going to always be the same. While I can have something certain pixel by certain pixel, be aware of your DPI and your color space. So for this, I'm going to go to Photo. I'm going to just pick a 7x5. Also be aware that if I was going to print this, I may want to change my color mode from RGB to CMYK. I also have options for grayscale, bitmap, and lab color. Lab color being a special print color, RGB being my screen resolution, grayscale meaning I have no color, so I wouldn't be able to work in a color space. Bitmap would be typically a 2-color. So I have options for 8-bit. Then my background contents, if I want it to be black or white, pre-selected background color, transparent or a custom. Typically only work with a white or a transparent. So if you wanted to start out with a transparent background, you can. So right now I have 7x5. I can also change what unit of measure I would like. Right now, because I selected that preset one, it's set to inches, but I can reset to pixels or centimeters, millimeters, points, or picas, whichever one you are working with. Because I'm in the US, I'm going to set it to inches. I can also name my artboard here. By default, it's usually Untitled 1, Untitled 2. So if you know what you're going to be naming it, I'm going to call mine Test Project. I can name that. And then I will hit Create. And what this creates for me is now I have that transparent background so I can see those gray and white squares that comes in as that Photoshop default. And then now when I open up Photoshop, your workspace might look a little bit different. I'm going to go back to Essentials, and that might also look different from mine. So in your Photoshop, as well as most other Adobe programs, if you go into that top right corner, there's something that looks like a little kind of square desktop guy, and that is a drop down. That's something called your workspace. So your workspace is the arrangement of your palettes within the given Adobe program. So This is the Essentials palette, which has been determined by Adobe to be the essential things you need. You have options for 3D. So if you're working in a 3D workspace, it's going to change it: motion, painting, photography, graphics, and web. You can also create your own workspace, and you can save your own workspaces. So if you get things just the way you like, as far as arrangements of palettes that you like to work in, where it's just so, you can actually save and export those workspaces if you were to move around on computers. So let's say you got a new computer or something like that, or you're going to work on somebody else's computer, you can save those workspaces to your Adobe library and then reload them on a new machine. So there's less of that jolt to you if you get a way you're comfortable working. I'm going to just leave mine in Essentials for the moment. Actually, let me change just so you see the difference. If I go to Motion, see, now I have different palettes popping up that are more key to working in a motion and a timeline type of thing. So I'm going to go back to Essentials just because this is a basic training video, and show you some of the different tools. So I'm going to go down the left side here. These are all your tools that you work with. I like that if I go over them, they kind of highlight. So top one is the Move tool. It can move a selection or a layer. I don't have anything currently, so I can't move it. But if I want to move something around, I would use the Move tool. It also gives you the key. So if I hit the V key, if I selected on, let's say, the Slice tool here, and I hit V, it will go to that Move tool. So if you're a Photoshop power user, a lot of times you're not going to be clicking on the tool to change. You may just click the key on your keyboard. Marquee Tool, these make selections. There are more marquees underneath. By default, you may have the rectangular marquee. There's elliptical, single row, and single column. They put down a little line of marching ants. If I draw it around, you'll see it makes a little line that moves around. They look like little marching ants. That allows me to make a selection. Then I have my Lasso tool, and there's more lassos under here. Yours might be default to this regular Lasso tool. The Lasso tool allows me to draw around and make an organic selection. You see how that gives me kind of whatever, so I can just lasso around something I'm looking for, and that gives me that selection. The polygonal one will only make certain shapes. It only makes straight lines. And the magnetic one, it requires an image to be here. It will magnet around where Photoshop thinks the edge is of something. Your Magic Wand tool allows you to make selections. There is also the Quick Select tool. Actually, it might be yours, by default might be Object Selection. There's also Quick Select, which is a handy dandy tool that allows you to brush in a selection, versus Magic Wand will select nearby pixels. We have our Crop tool is the default. See, mine remembered the last things I did it. Crop tool allows you to change the size of your artboard. You can get larger or smaller here. That will actually change the size of your artboard. There are other cutting tools under here, so you can cut by perspective. If you're trying to perspective crop or slice, you can slice your image for output. The Frame tool allows you to create placeholder frames for images. So it gives you a really nice little example here when you hover over it. If you're trying to place in a different image and have it kind of cropped, you can create that Frame tool. Your Eyedropper tool allows you to sample colors. So if you're trying to pull a color from an image and match, there's also more underneath. So you can have Color Sampler, which gives you a whole sample around there. 3D Material Eyedropper if you're trying to get a 3D substrate. Your Spot Healing Brush, your Patch tool, Red Eye tool, all of those things are helpful for healing any flaws that you may have in an image. Can heal. Your Brush tool, this allows you to paint. Super important for digital painting. There's a bunch of the Pencil tool, Color Mixer tool. There's other tools under there. Your Clone Stamp, I also call it the Rubber Stamp tool just because it looks like a rubber stamp, allows you to clone an object across the artboard. Your History Brush tool allows you to go back into a different state in history. It works with the History panel, which is over here. So I can see here's some of the states that I have in history. So if I was using the history brush, you see there, you see that tool coming back in again. Here's history brushes right there. So if I wanted to brush back, I select a state in history and then can brush back to that. My eraser tool allows me to erase different things. There's a background erase and a magic erase under there as well. Be careful, that can become destructive editing. So if you have a flattened image and you start erasing, you've just erased everything. Be very careful with the eraser tool. Your gradient tool allows you to draw gradients, much like you see there. There's a paint bucket under there as well. Smudge tool allows you to smudge. Think about grabbing your finger if you were to use pencil. Very helpful for anyone who is doing digital drawing, digital painting within Photoshop. Your burn and dodge tool. These are standard photo tools. If you do darkroom photography, the dodge tool will allow you to get a little bit of less exposure, so that kind of deepens it. The burn tool, or excuse me, lightens it. Your dodge tool will lighten. The burn tool will make something darker. So if you need to darken an object, it will make it darker. This burns it in and like it is giving it extra exposure, so you're giving more exposure time to something versus less exposure. Point tool, or excuse me, pen tool. The pen tool works just like the pen tool in Illustrator, where you are putting down anchor points and drawing vector Bezier curves. Your type tool allows you to create type with any font and size. There's also other ones in there. A vertical type tool I never recommend using, as well as type masks. Your direct select tool, there's also path select tool. These work just like they do in Illustrator. So if I had drawn with my pen tool and I want to select those anchor points, I would use that for those. My rectangle tool, there's also other shapes under here. So this is kind of your shape tool. So ellipse, triangle, polygon, line, and custom shape. If you wanted to just draw any old shape on your artboard, you can just draw a shape. That is an option for you. There's my shapes. My hand tool allows to pan over to different parts of an image. So right now I can see 100%. If I wanted to grab my hand tool and move around, oh, that got a little crazy there. I can pan to different areas of my image. I prefer to hold down the space bar and pan around personally. I felt like that gave me a little more control. And then you have your magnifying, which allows you to zoom in or zoom out. If you held down the Alt or Option key, you can zoom out or zoom in to your tool. Those are your tools along in the toolbar. If you notice you have colors, by default it should be that black and white. If you have different colors here, you can just click that and it'll turn to black and white. Right now this is my foreground color, this is my background color. I can swap those, the little area. And then down here I have quick mask mode, which we will not get into in this video, but if you were trying to mask areas and brush in areas to mask out, you would work with a mask and then change screen mode. Other palette, any and all palettes that you are looking for and working with in Photoshop will be under Window. These are all the additional palettes that you can open. So for instance, if I want to work with my type tool, and I want to work with my different characters, I can grab my type tool, start typing, and this will allow me to, so by default the type tool gives me the ability to type. Now I can start changing that font, I can change the paragraph style, I can change the colors, make it larger or smaller. Photoshop has this little neat thing here that some other Adobe programs don't have, which if you kind of go over, I can set the type here, the drop down, I can say, okay, I want it to be 30 point, or I could simply type it in if I said I want it to be 45 point. Or if I'm not quite sure, I get a little side to side arrow that if I kind of click and drag to the right, it makes it larger. If I drag to the left, it makes it smaller. That's pretty fun. And I can do it with all the things. So as far as tracking, I can track it out bigger, I can drag it narrower by simply clicking and dragging right or left. So that's a fun little feature that Photoshop has in a lot of its palettes, that you can simply drag back and forth for movements that way. So let's go ahead and bring in an image and start playing with some of these different palettes and different tools. I've gone ahead and placed in a JPEG from Adobe Stock into my Photoshop canvas here. And so we're just going to look at what some of this looks like with some of our basic panels or palettes and tools. So the first one I'm going to pull out is the layers panel. Now it's really important to know that Photoshop is layer based. So, and that goes in stacking order. The order of your layers absolutely matters. So if you recall, like about 2 seconds ago, I had drawn in, if I turn off the little eye that shows this photo, I can see here's my type and my little shapes that I drew a couple seconds ago. So if I wanted to move this, I could move this under here. You see the hand drag around. Now this is behind there. So stacking order absolutely matters when it comes to your layers. It's also important to name your layers. So if you are working and you have multiple layers, it's really important to understand what those are. Eventually you have like rectangle 1. That really does, maybe I only have one rectangle. That's not a terrible thing, but if I want to name it something more explicit like pink, rectangle, and circle, it's a little clearer than what I mean when I am going through and toggling on and off the visibility of my layers. So to turn off visibility, you just click the little eyeball. To turn it back on, you just turn it on. So I can turn off those in my layers. To rename, I simply just double click on the name and that will highlight. If I click off, that will accept that change. So let's go ahead and select. In order to change various layers, I can move and edit this even though I can't see it. If I grab my move tool and I'm highlighted on this layer, I can move. Oh, excuse me, I do have auto select turned on. So if I uncheck auto select and go back on that layer, then I can move that shape without being on that layer. You see how it updates that thumbnail a little bit? I'm moving that. So if something is not moving or doing what you think it should be doing, first place to double check is that you are highlighted on the correct layer. So I'm going to highlight back on this layer. I will turn back on auto select because I do like that as a feature. And then we can go ahead and see what some of these tools do. So I'm going to move, that move tool will move this photo within the frame. Let's say I use my eraser tool. It's not going to allow that on this image. And here's the reason. When I embedded this, there's a little icon that shows up right here that lets me know that this is a smart object. And we're not going to totally get into smart objects right now in this video, but smart objects, because it's linking to an additional resource, a lot of these editing features aren't available. If I said, hey, I want to edit that, I can simply control click on there and convert smart object. Sorry, that was not the right one. Excuse me, not convert to smart object. That was not the right thing. I want to click rasterize layer. And you see that icon disappears when I rasterize that layer. Now if I want to erase this, which I have my eraser tool selected, and it's a teeny tiny brush, I can now do it. I'm going to enlarge my brush. Right now it's 8 pixels. When I have the eraser selected, this little brush option highlights here. I can change the size of the brush. Now it's big. I can change the hardness of that brush. So hard will, like the 100% hard is a very hard edge, will look like that. If I drop the hardness down to 0, it becomes a very soft edge and erases like that. I can also adjust the opacity and the flow of the brush. So 100% opaque is going to take it all out. Push the flow up here too. So that will take it all out, versus if I want to kind of softly fade out this image, I can more softly fade with a lower opacity brush and maybe feather out the edges of that image. That all looks terrible. So what I'm going to do to undo that, while I can do multiple undos, which is under Edit Undo, I can keep going undo, undo, undo. I like to use my History panel, which if yours is not open, it's under Window, History. They're in alphabetical order, History. And that shows every last move that I did. By default, you have 20 moves. I will show you in a minute how to get more states of history. And I can simply step back into my history. So if you've done a lot of things and you want to step back more and not just keep doing undo, undo, undo over and over and over, you can step back in states in history. If you want more than the standard 20 states of history that it comes with, you can go into your preferences, which for a Mac user is under Photoshop. I believe for PC it's under File. And then you go to Preferences. So Photoshop Preferences, it's actually under Performance. And then I can look at states of history. You can turn it all the way up to the maximum of 1,000 states of history. I typically do about at least 100 because I don't like the 20 it comes with. This also is an interesting place to come into on the performance. If you have an older computer or your computer's having difficulty running Photoshop where it crashes it, you can turn down how much memory Photoshop uses on your machine, particularly if you're running heavier things. You can also add in, if you have an external, you can use the external as an additional storage space for it. This would be where you would set that up. So just keep that in your mind. If your computer's having difficulty, turn down the amount of memory that you're allowing Photoshop to use. It can sometimes make a difference, especially if you're on an older machine. So liking this, I'm going to click OK. That will reset those states of history. All right, let's play with some more tools here. So let's say I want to clone this little ribbon. Let me zoom in on that ribbon here. I can use my rubber stamp tool or clone stamp tool. I will call it a rubber stamp tool. To use that, I'm simply going to hold down the Option key, and that gives me that little crosshair. Wherever I select my crosshair, I'm just going to click, and then it gives me a little preview of what I'm going to start brushing in. Now, your clone stamp tool brushes work just like any other brush in Photoshop. Your shapes are up here. You can load other shapes beyond the standard ones that it comes with. There's a ton that we'll do a separate video on brushes. I can adjust the size if I want it bigger, the hardness, the transparency of any of those things. And so all I have to do to clone this is start brushing it in, and it gives me a little crosshair of where it's sampling from. And then you can see that I'm cloning that because I have the opacity set to 56% and the flow set to 43. It's giving me a slightly washed out version of it. So I can just keep going over and it'll keep painting in more opaque of a shape. And that clone that shape for me. So let's grab our burn and dodge tool. So burn is going to make something darker. It gives, I guess it would be technically less exposure. So if I thought that this book right here was too light, I'll make that my brush a little bit bigger here. And then I can just simply burn in that book. Now that right now I'm burning in the highlights, so the highlights will grab the lighter shades. I can grab midtones, and that will grab the midtones within there. I can also grab the shadows, so if you want to burn in, say, darker shades to make them darker, how that's going to grab those. That actually looks kind of nice to burn in those deeper shades here. It gives a little more richness to these books. It's not a huge change. Be careful with your burn and dodge tool. It can start looking real funky because it's acting like it's not going to just make it darker or lighter. It's acting like more or less exposure from a camera. So be careful. When in doubt, you can also turn the exposure down. The higher the exposure, the more extreme it's going to be. I had that set pretty high. I might turn that down a little bit because I prefer to go over it a few more times than to really just blast it all at once. The dodge tool again is going to lighten this up. So if I wanted to dodge out, if I thought this was maybe a little too dark in some area, this photo is actually not terribly dark, but, or if I wanted to really blow out the highlights, make these highlights really bright on these books, you see how that kind of really changes that contrast and makes them look nice and shiny. So that's how you can use that burn and dodge tool and really mess with kind of the exposure a little bit, where I'll lighten in these highlights, I burned in these dark areas. And now I'll show you the difference. If I step back in history, that's what it looked like before I started burning and dodging, and that's the after. So it can really change the exposure of your shot. Go lightly. Another tool you may use often, at least I like to use often, is spot healing. So if you have a flaw, if you have dust somewhere on your camera lens, happens all the time, that you said, oh, I really don't like this little white edge. Let me go and just kind of paint right over it. It's going to sample from around it. Paint it again, and I can kind of heal that out. It basically samples the colors around it to heal that area. You see how that kind of took out that book? I'm just using it just like a brush, and that takes that out. That looks pretty nice. To remove those little white bookmarks that I might have found distracting or may have been an error. Let's go ahead and look at our selection tools. So our Marquee Tool can make a selection. So if I wanted to take this chunk of books, apply that down because I have that selected, I have the book layer selected. If I just marqueed around it and I grab my move tool, you see how a little scissors pops up? It says it's going to cut that area, and that cut that right out. Now because this is still the same layer, if I deselect that, this is now what this whole photo looks like, because this is still on the same layer as this. Undo that because I don't like it. I'll show you what the magnetic lasso looks like for making selections. This book might be a little monochromatic, just because it likes to find it. The magnetic lasso tool is best for anything with a hard edge. So if I click on it, it's trying to find edges that it sees in the photo. I've already messed it up. Let's undo that. So when you do it, zoom in and be really particular about the edge that you are getting close to. And you see how it's kind of magneting to where it sees edges. So it's doing an okay job. Be real careful with it. It's pretty easy to get lost on that, but that's how that tool works. Works best for anything with a hard edge. Anything with a soft edge is kind of nightmarish. Your brush tool, you can paint anything. If I paint right on this layer, let's say let me paint something nice and bright so you can see it. If I paint a nice red color like this, that is now part of that photo. So if I wanted to have a red squiggle and then be able to move it around, I'm going to need to make a new layer, because right now if I'm selected on this layer, anything I put on there is stuck to that layer. So if I want to have a new layer, I can click the little fly up menu and hit new layer, shift command or control N, so hamburger, new layer. I'm going to call it red squiggle. And I'm just going to paint in my squiggle. And you see how that showed up on that layer. Now if I want to move it, I can see how that is affecting, like looks over top of this. Maybe I want to paint in another one. Can change that brush. Right now it's 87% opacity. Let's make a real hard edge. Let's grab a different shape brush. There's some that come preloaded. If you do a Google search for free Photoshop brushes, you'll find a lot of fun ones you can download. And there's a hard edge brush at 100% opacity. And now this is still on the same layer, so if I move it around, it's going to all move together. So let's use a history state. So if I step back and said, you know, I put that ribbon on this book and I really don't like it, I can go back into my history panel. Now I could undo it, but let's pretend I want to just get rid of maybe these little spots in between. So if I go back into my history to before I put that in, wherever I select, so if I clicked on here, I can see there it wasn't there. Okay, that, come back to where I'm at working in life, check on my history layer. So it's going to revert to, that's the source for the history brush, to this layer. So now if I grab the history brush, I might have to move it one more just because we had raster. Oh, sorry. Have to be selected on the right layer. You see I was not on the right layer and it wouldn't let me do it. So now I can grab the history brush on this layer and I can brush it back in and actually brush out that action that I had done. I didn't undo all the actions in between, so if I wanted to keep some of the burning and dodging and things like that and decided, oh, I want to undo this but not the other things I've done, the history brush is a great way to kind of brush back to a different state in history. So let's look at a few more things we can do within our layers panel. The layers panel is actually very powerful because there's a lot of things hidden in here. It's probably going to be your most used panel within Photoshop. So with this layer right here that I have, this book layer, I've got options to add to it. So there's options for layer styles. I can add masks. I can do a new filler adjustment layer. I can create new groups. So if I have a bunch of layers that I want to group together into a folder, you can do that as well if you're very organized. So let's see what some of these, let's do a one of these little guys. So I've got options for solid color, gradient patterns that I can fill it with color, levels, curves, exposures, vibrance, hue and saturation. So all of these things will affect my color. I recommend going through and playing with all of these. There's more here than I can show in a video. I mean, I really could. It'd be a 4-hour video easily. Go through and see what they do. I'll hit the highlights here. So something like levels. So in my general photo, if I said, hey, you know, there's not enough contrast in this photo, it's kind of washy, or maybe the lights are too light, you know, there's not enough deep contrast. This can kind of pump up the levels. Typically you want to just slide your sliders in where I see how it's going to make my deeper, darker tones. This is the dark tones, mid-tones, light tones. If I slide the darker one in, it's going to make my darker tones darker. If I slide the light one in to the right, it's going to make them lighter. And then my midpoint, I can make lighter or darker. That becomes highly contrasty. This photos may not be the best, but if you want to just get a little more oomph to your photo, I can slide that in if I wanted to kind of pump up some of these blacks in there. That looks nice. So when I have this here, it is also affecting the layers below it. It doesn't affect it too much because that pink, you might see a subtle shift in that pink. When that layer style applies, it's applying to every layer below it. So I can move that, but it's going to apply to every layer below it. If you want it to be toggled or tied to just one single layer. With your fill adjustment selected, I'm going to hold down the Option key or Alt key on a PC, and you see that little arrow pop up. I'm going to click on that. Now it's tied to just this layer. I get the little arrow. So if I turn that off, now there is really, you see it, turn this one off, but I turn that, you see how they're tied together? So these two are now tied together. It's not affecting anything below it. That's a way that you can have one of those adjustment layers applied to just that. Let's put one more on to see what it looks like. Let's go ahead and look at Hue and Saturation. This will be a gigantic shift. So when I pop that open, it opens up in my Properties pane. If I want to adjust the whole hue of the photo, you can see that really adjusts those colors from more to a red, to a blue, to a green. I had all those browns. I typically don't move this terribly far unless I have just one solid color that really does need to shift. If you said a photo is just overall too yellow or too blue, you may move it there. A lot of times you're not going to move it too terribly far from its original source. Like, it doesn't look bad, a little more red, which puts in -6. Oh, hang on. Just in the negatives a little bit, gives it a little more reddish tone. That's not bad. I can pump up the saturation. As we remember from the lecture, saturation adds more color. That is a deeply saturated photo. I can desaturate the photo and make it almost black and white. And then I can adjust the lightness of the photo. This more or less will wash it out. It doesn't add more white, it kind of just washes it out. Like if you stuck the photo in the sun for a while, or the darkness of the photo kind of just, ugh. I typically don't do too much there either. A lot of times you're not going to stray too far from center, but it does make it darker. It'll go all the way to black or all the way to white. But if I wanted to make it a little more dark, there we go. It's totally desaturated. Desaturated there a little bit. So this is also, now I've got that adjustment layer. These are live editing layers. I can always go back and edit them as I so choose. I can also delete them if I wanted to get rid of this levels. I can simply highlight that layer and click the little trash can. That will delete it. It'll ask, say, hey, do you really want to do that? And I'm like, yep, sure. Once it's gone, it's gone. But they're always there for you to edit. Apparently it didn't delete, just turned itself off. Get the heck in the trash can. So that's thrown out. So now I just have this there, editable. You can also do this in a destructive way. This way is called non-destructive editing because I can always go back and edit it. I can take this and apply it to a different layer. It's non-destructive because I can turn it off and I'm right back to that original photo. Let's look at a destructive editing technique to accomplish the same thing. So with this photo selected, I'm going to go to Image Adjustments, and you see how that whole list is here again. And I can go Hue and Saturation. Those same options are there for me. So I can adjust that hue and saturation again. Now that looks the same to anybody viewing the final photo. However, once I save and close this photo, I can't get back that original image. So that is not an optimal way to adjust your hue, to adjust any of those, like any of these options found here. You can do them destructively. I highly recommend doing them from the Layers panel because that becomes non-destructive editing. So now that we've explored a little bit with the Layers panel, some destructive and non-destructive editing, and some of our tools, I'm going to show you a quick thing about image sizes. So if you wanted to know how big is an image, let's say you grabbed an image from online somewhere and you said, how big is this? How do I know if it's high res? Easy way to go is to go image, image size. So an image, image size, it will show me how big the image size is. So this current image is 9.01 megabytes. It is 2100 pixels by 1500 pixels. So it's 7 inches by 5 inches at 300 dpi. That is how big that image is. So if I wanted to change the size of that image, there's a few ways I can do it. I can hit, right now I have the width and height toggled together. So if I made this 8 inches, it would size proportionally, or 5 inches, that will size proportionally. If I wanted to and keep consistent resolution at 300 dpi, if I wanted to resample the image, all three are tied together. So if I said, okay, let's go ahead and make this 8, you see how it's going to drop that resolution. Versus if I made it 5, it's going to change the resolution. .57. So if I uncheck resample here, I can drop this down to 72 dpi. So if I said, okay, this is a print resolution size, I can drop it to 72 dpi and watch what happens to my image size. It goes from 9 megabytes to 531 kilobytes. This would be the exact same size on the web, so it would be a 5 by 7 inch thing on the web at 72 dpi. So if I said, yes, I'm sizing for web, okay, I can click OK. And you now see that that image is much smaller. It has changed the size of it. Now what I want you to be hyper aware of is that if I said, oops, I made a mistake, let me go back and go image, image size, and pop it back up to 300. This is not, I have lost that resolution. Once I clicked OK, Photoshop took all that information and threw it out. That's what when it changed that file size, instead of saying, I've got 9 megabytes worth of information here, and now I have 500 kilobytes, it threw all that information away. So if you change the image size and you save and close it, that image is gone forever. That information is gone. Photoshop does not recover it. So be very aware of that. That is how the program works. You can't get back image size once you've eliminated it. Fortunately, I have not closed this file, so I still have those history states, and I can just jump right back. Hey, that information's back. Pretty cool. So I'm going to go ahead and save this file. Because I have a layered working document, anytime you're working in Photoshop, you want to keep a layered working thing. I've got all these cool layers that I've worked with. You can see when I apply that to that hue and saturation to that. I've got these cool layers that I've worked with. Maybe I want to come back and work on it later. So I'm going to go to File, Save. I'm just going to save it onto my computer. You can save it to your Creative Cloud. So by default, since it's layered, it's going to save as a .psd, which is a Photoshop document. That's what .psd saves as. You want to keep a PSD, a layered PSD for yourself somewhere. That way you know it's your working document in your folder. The other options that you'll see in here are large document format, Photoshop PDF, or a TIFF. TIFFs can kind of save layers. I don't really recommend that, as that should be more of a final export. The other options that you have, if you were like, hey, I used Photoshop before and there used to be more options, there's this little option here that says save a copy. It will make a copy of this, and now I have all my other options, such as a GIF or a JPEG, or PDF is here, or a PNG, that I might want to also save these as. Be aware that those are not layered images. If I saved it as a JPEG, we'll go ahead and save that. I'm going to go ahead and open that as in a new document here. And notice I only have this layer. I don't have any of that information. I can't go back and change this. This becomes a flattened file. So be sure to save a PSD for yourself somewhere. anytime you're working, even if your client or your friend or whoever you're turning the files over to just need a JPEG, keep a PSD because you may be asked to do edits. So that's some basics of getting working in Photoshop. Go ahead and get started and start.